Welcome to meeting number 30 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So that you are aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. To ensure an orderly meeting, I'd like to outline a few rules to follow. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for the meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Please select your preference. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair, and that when you are not speaking, your microphone should be on mute. I also ask that you not talk over each other so that the interpreters can do their work. As is my normal practice, I will hold up a yellow card for when you have 30 seconds left in your intervention, and I will hold up a red card for when your time for questions has expired. Please make sure that you are on gallery view so that you can see me giving you the indications. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on February 23rd, 2021, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology is meeting today to undertake the study on competitiveness in Canada. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses. We have Yelena Larkin, Associate Professor of Finance from York University, David Vaillancourt, Partner, Affleck Green McMurtry, from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Laura Jones, Executive Vice President and Chief Strategic Officer. From C.D. Howe Institute, Mr. Benjamin Dawkins, Director, Public Affairs. And from the National Coalition of Chiefs, Dale Swampy, President. Each witness will have 5 minutes to present, followed by questions. With that, we will start with Yelena Larkin. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, committee members, fellow witnesses, and everyone else. I appreciate the opportunity to present my views at this committee. Overall, my statement that I'm about to make is based on the draft of a research paper that my co-author, Ray Bhavani, and I have completed in 2019. In this paper, we ask whether the nature of Canadian economic environment has changed over the past few decades. Our research question was motivated by the trends revealed in the US markets, as well as academic articles that argue that product markets in the US have become more concentrated over the past 2 decades. In the project that underlies this statement, my co-author and I examined the business environment in Canada from the standpoint of financial markets. By analyzing the data that is typically used in corporate finance research, my work provides some descriptive statistical analysis of Canadian financial markets that potentially can serve as a starting point for future and more detailed research. In the center of our analysis are Canadian publicly traded firms. We first focus on the number of firms traded on Toronto Stock Exchange, TSX. Since publicly traded firms are typically the key players in the economy, tend to be much larger compared to private firms, the falling number of public firms could be a first sign of structural change. This is what we find. The number of non-financial firms, that is, firms that are not set up as investment vehicles, such as investment fund, mutual fund, and so on, has indeed dropped by around 30% since its peak around 2006, 2008. To ensure that the trend does not come due to industry composition, we also split the overall number of firms into major sectors and find that the decline in the number of firms is not limited to a specific sector, but rather has affected firms across the entire spectrum of Canadian industries. Next, we turn to examining the size of public firms measured as the market capitalization in constant Canadian dollars of 2002. Market cap measures what company is worth in the open market and therefore serves as the most updated indicator of its perceived value. In addition, it reflects the market's perception of the firm's future prospects and incorporates both tangible and intangible components. We find that the mean firm size has been persistently rising over the last 35 years. However, the growth has not been equal, and large firms have essentially grown at a much steeper rate, over the past 10 or 15 years. For example, an inflation-adjusted market cap of firms in the top quartile of size distribution has swelled from $250 million in 2008 to almost $1 billion in 2016. We also explore the combined effects of firm number and firm size by constructing a measure of concentration, Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is defined as the sum of squared market shares of all the firms within the same industry. We find that concentration has increased in most industries, and this increase has been economically significant. Further consistent with the increase in concentration, we find that the largest firm in each industry have become more dominant. The share of sales by market leaders compared to total industry sales has also increased substantially over the same period. In the second part of the paper, we examine possible implication of the systematic increase in concentration along with the decline in the number of public firms. It is possible that the increase in dominance of large firms could reflect barriers to entry. In general, barriers can be driven by a number of various factors, which include economies of scale, large capital requirements, regulatory changes that potentially discourage new firms from entering the market, and increasing role of technology behind all this. To examine the barriers to entry explanation, we perform several tests. First, we look at the link between concentration and profitability. If markets are becoming more concentrated due to greater barriers to entry, we should find evidence that profit margins are increasing in those industries. And consistent with this argument, our analysis shows a positive and significant link between accounting measures and concentration. Okay, looks like I'm running out of time. In this case, let me mention that going forward, I would like to set these results into a large frame and consider the relevance of Canadian public firms becoming more valuable and obtaining better investment opportunity. More research is needed to understand the reason behind the secular decline in the number of firms, which is accompanied by increase in size and vibrant M&A activity. I hope these findings can provide an opportunity for policymakers to examine the trends of increased concentration further. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Well, now we will hear from Monsieur Vaillancourt. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and members of the committee, my name is David Vaillancourt. I'm a partner at the law firm Affleck Green McMurtry. My practice includes competition law and commercial litigation. I believe that the abuse of dominance provisions of the Competition Act should be amended to allow private litigants to challenge anti-competitive conduct by monopolists. Right now, the Commissioner of Competition is the only one who can bring such abuse of dominance proceedings. Abuse of dominance involves acts undertaken by a dominant firm against competitors in the market that substantially lessens or prevents competition. This generally means firms with more than 50% of market share. It's about a monopolist using its position to squeeze out the competition and maintain or enhance its own market power. When a victimized competitor has a problem with an anti-competitive monopolist, their only option is to make a complaint to the Commissioner of Competition. If the Commissioner of Competition does not decide to move forward with the matter, there is nothing the victimized competitor can do. The Commissioner of Competition has to be very selective with the abuse of dominance cases that he brings forward. Abuse of dominance tends to take a backseat to enforcement of the criminal provisions of the Competition Act, as well as merger review. The Commissioner of Competition publishes annual statistics about the complaints he receives under the Competition Act's various civilly reviewable provisions, which includes abuse of dominance. I've previously emailed a copy of these statistics to members of the committee. The vast majority of complaints are about abuse of dominance. In the 2019-2020 year, it was about 80% of complaints. The stats show that there were 467 complaints that year. Out of those complaints, only 11 investigations were commenced, which turned into 3 inquiries. The enforcement activities were also very limited. There was 1 case with a consent order, 1 case with an alternative case resolution, which is another form of settlement, and 1 case before the tribunal. The under-enforcement of the abuse of dominance provisions is not a new trend. Since 1986, there have only been 14 abuse of dominance proceedings brought before the Competition Tribunal. The Commissioner of Competition does not have the resources he needs to robustly police monopolists in Canada. This is causing injury not just to competitors, but to competition generally and to Canadian consumers. It's clear with the current abuse of dominance regime, it is not working. Change is needed. Enforcement would be enhanced if there was a private right of action, where victimized competitors could hold monopolists to account. Even the threat of private action would encourage change in behavior by monopolists to avoid litigation. The cases don't need to get litigated all the way through to trial. There are already several reviewable matters in the Competition Act that do allow a private right of action with leave of the Competition Tribunal. The right to bring a private application for those sections is contained in Section 103.1 of the Act, which sets out the mechanics for seeking leave of the tribunal. This section could be amended to also add the right to seek leave to bring an abuse of dominance proceeding. Private litigants should also be allowed to make a claim for damages suffered as a result of anti-competitive conduct. Obtaining a go-forward remedy changing monopolist conduct would be helpful, but economic loss caused by the anti-competitive conduct in the past should be compensated. Victimized competitors are more likely to incur the cost of following through with legal proceedings if there is some chance of monetary recovery. The proposal I'm making today is in line with our international peers. Both the United States and Europe permit private actions for abuse of dominance and monopolization. In fact, private action is the primary method of enforcement for monopolization in the United States at a rate of about 10 to 1. When a monopolist acts in an anti-competitive way, it hurts consumers in the long run by damaging competition. Less competition means higher prices and lower quality for consumers. Amending the Competition Act to allow private abuse of dominance proceedings would be pro-competition, pro-consumer, and would bring Canada in line with its international peers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Laura Jones. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Bonjour à tous. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to focus my comments today on the opportunity to improve competitiveness by modernizing our approach to regulation. I'm the Chief Strategic Officer for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. So I bring the perspective of small business to the table, but my comments are also informed by my recent experience chairing the advisory committee on regulatory, the external advisory committee on regulatory competitiveness. So I have some slides that, and I will, if you want to follow along, they are there to support my comments. On slide 2, the regulatory modernization slide shows you that this could also be described as regulatory competitiveness or regulatory.
Ms. Jones, I'm just going to let you know, I paused the clock. We do not have the slides because they have to be provided to us in both official languages. So if you've provided them to the clerk in only one official language,
no, we provided them in both.
Okay, so I just wanted to let you know we don't have them.
Yeah,
So
we'll distribute them around.
Thank you so much. Just so that if you're wondering why we're not following along, that's why.
That's fine. Thank you. I will speak to them, and I think you have them in both official languages so they can be distributed. So regulatory modernization can be described as both excellence or competitiveness. Certainly those terms were used interchangeably by the External Advisory Committee, and really includes 3 important things. So red tape reduction. The second important thing is supporting innovation. So often new innovations require some regulatory support, and doing that in a nimble way would be consistent with regulatory excellence. And of course, maintaining high levels of health, safety, environmental protection, the things that Canadians care about. So those would be the 3 things: a minimum of red tape, support for innovation, and maintaining excellence in the outcomes that Canadians care about that would be consistent with regulatory competitiveness or excellence. In our view, this requires a sustained culture shift within government. The good news is that COVID-19 has created some of those conditions for the culture shift, with more nimbleness and more focus, for example, on outcomes of regulation. But there are some challenges in this regard. And one of the challenges is there's not a lot of great data available, particularly data from government, on either the cumulative regulatory burden or our progress towards reducing that burden. And so with the lack of data comes a lack of accountability, and also there's a lack of reporting. When we look at what data are available, the World Bank is one that's often cited, and Canada gets very low marks on that. But just to give you a sense of the data challenges there, our rankings are based on, for permitting, for example, are based on a sole warehouse in Toronto, and that establishes our ranking for and how long it takes to get a permit, and that establishes the ranking for the whole country. Now, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business has done some of its own research, and you can see some of that in the report I have cited in the presentation. And I'll just run through a couple of stats to help you understand the challenge from that perspective. So the cost of regulation to businesses of all sizes in Canada is now $39 billion a year. This was done earlier this year, this estimate. It doesn't include the cost of complying with COVID-19 regulations, which we know is significant for small business. And of course, not all of that cost is red tape. The estimate of the amount of that could be eliminated without affecting the outcomes we all care about is about $11 billion a year, or about 28% of that total cost. The other thing we find is these costs are very regressive. So the smaller the business, the higher the per employee costs. And I think that is something worth paying attention to. Another finding from the report is nearly 2/3 of businesses are now telling us they would not advise their children to start a business in Canada based on the current cost of regulation. This is up 15 percentage points from the last time we did this survey in 2017. Nearly 9 out of 10 are saying this regulatory burden adds significant stress to their lives, and 8 out of 10 are saying excessive regulation significantly reduces productivity. In terms of recommendations going forward, I think regulatory excellence is a huge opportunity for Canada to be more competitive and also to reduce the barriers for small business. So we have 3 recommendations. One is to make this a priority right across government, leveraging the newfound agility from COVID, some of the things we did differently in COVID-19, for example, approving a vaccine in a year, something that would normally take the better part of a decade. The second recommendation is measurement. We need better measurement. Both British Columbia and Manitoba provide good models that the federal government could look at, and we recommend reducing that burden by 25%. And finally, setting up a place where citizens can highlight red tape, so a digital portal where they could go, and then that would be, those examples would be distributed to deputies who could take action on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll now turn to Mr. Dacus. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. And I want to relate the economic harm of excess permit costs to Canadian homebuyers and small businesses today. So first, let's look at permit costs to people looking to get into the housing market. Restrictions on housing supply and extra costs hinder the efficiency of the housing market. And recent CD Howe Institute research has found a persistent gap between the cost of building new homes and their market price in major Canadian cities. And this is a regulatory and permit tax on housing. A well-functioning housing market results in the market price of housing being pretty close to the cost of just building it. And if prices persistently exceed this construction cost, it's often due to the barriers that inhibit new construction. And these barriers often stem from excessive regulations and permit requirements. And this regulatory tax is huge in some places. We estimate that home buyers in Vancouver see an extra cost of $644,000 for the average new home because of supply limits. Across Canada's largest and most restrictive cities, and this is mostly in BC and Ontario, home buyers paid hundreds of thousands of dollars more than the construction cost of a newly built house because of limits on supply. It's an extra $112,000 for home buyers in Ottawa. In Calgary, an extra $152,000, and an extra $168,000 in the Greater Toronto Area. Vancouver's cost of housing restrictions are by far the largest in Canada, resulting in a 50% extra cost.
L'interprète nous signale en français que la description est très difficile à entendre.
We're told that the description is very difficult to follow, and that Mr. Dashi's comments are very difficult to understand.
One moment, we're just going to check with the room. We're having some connectivity issues. You're coming across very scratchy, Mr. Duckis, so I want to make sure that the interpreters can hear you. If you could hold one moment, and I've stopped the clock.
Let me know if you want me to do an audio test.
Yeah, actually, if you could just unplug and plug back in that headset, sometimes that fixes the issue. But it doesn't look like it's connectivity related. Sometimes it's just the headset just needs a reboot.
How's that? Is that better? Oh, I'll keep going. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you now.
Okay,
Please continue.
I'll
Thank you.
continue. Apologies for that.
No, not at all. Thank you.
So Vancouver's cost of housing restrictions are by far the largest in Canada, resulting in a 50% extra cost that's on par with studies that have done similar studies measuring the extra cost in places like Manhattan. And on the other end of the spectrum, home buying costs in Montreal have stayed pretty close to construction costs. So why are housing costs so high elsewhere in Canada? We find that restrictions and extra costs on building new housing, such as zoning regulations, development charges, which don't apply in Quebec, by the way, and limits on land development are dramatically increasing the price of housing. What about small businesses? So the World Bank conducts an annual doing business survey that's become the global standard of every country's regulatory and permitting burden. And as Ms. Jones mentioned, among the 10 major measures of building business regulation and process, the World Bank includes the process time for a small business to obtain a construction permit for a small warehouse. Now, for a small business looking to develop a warehouse in Toronto, and this is the only Canadian city that the World Bank considers, and I'll get back to how to fix that oversight that Ms. Jones mentioned, it would take 248 days. It takes 28 days in South Korea, 36 in Singapore, 65 in Denmark or Finland. And major US cities like New York and Los Angeles see approvals within 2 to 3 months. Yet Toronto's over 8 months. So how do we fix this? So to expedite approvals, cities should increase their use of e-permitting. E-permitting is an online platform that connects all relevant building permit and planning processes. Such systems already have a proven track record of success across the globe and are starting to gain traction here. Leading by example, governments should also enact policies that set certain design and development standards for their own projects. The federal government could set an e-permitting system requirement and standard in conjunction with willing provinces. The problem with e-permitting is not technological, but it's training people currently working in and with today's permitting system. And that's both government and industry. Better training can be funded in part by the federal government. However, e-permitting is just a technical workaround of convoluted permit rules. It addresses the symptom, but not the cause. The fundamental root cause is too many different permit requirements for development approvals. Now, much of this is in the hands of provincial and municipal governments. So what can Ottawa do? First, the federal government could require that infrastructure grants, such as for transit or highways, only go to areas in which development is expedited. For example, Ottawa can designate affected residential or Ontario can designate affected residential or employment lands as subject to what's called a development permit system. And this system eliminates multiple application streams and sets strict timelines for approvals. Ottawa can require that provinces adopt that or a similar approval process for nearby areas when they get a federal grant. But as Ms. Jones noted, the World Bank study only applies to the city of Toronto. What about other places like York Region or Ottawa? The World Bank only measures the permitting cost in the largest municipal government in the country unless the government specifically requests that the World Bank take on a subnational study. The federal government could pass a motion asking the World Bank to adopt its cost of doing business study across the country. So with that, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And we will now go to Mr. Dale Swampy. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Oh, Mr. Swampy, you're on mute.
Sorry, good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today and study competitiveness in the study of competitiveness in Canada. My name is Dale Swampy. I'm a Samson Cree Nation member and a COVID survivor. Honored to be presenting to you from the traditional territory of the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Treaty 7 First Nations in Southern Alberta. I'm the president of the National Coalition of Chiefs, or the NCC, a coalition of industry supportive chiefs. Our mandate is to defeat unreserved poverty through the participation in our country's development of its natural resources. We work in cooperation and partnership and with natural resource proponents in an effort to enhance the economic prosperity of reserve communities. We also support Indigenous-led natural resource projects. I appreciate that you have included an Indigenous perspective on the panel today because Canada's ability to attract investment is a major challenge, more so today than any other time in our country's history. As you are aware, Canada has experienced a significant loss in its ability to compete on the international market, as well as within its own boundaries. We are no longer able to trade effectively between even our own provincial borders. Many would agree that this is a direct result of restricting regulatory barriers that have been introduced over the past few years. For example, we believe the tanker ban, or Bill C-48, was passed in order to ensure that Alberta's oil does not cross the borders of British Columbia and onto Tidewater. International trade as our most valuable commodity would have increased the standard of living of all Canadians, including First Nations. First Nation communities in BC and Alberta lost $2 billion in benefits when the Northern Gateway project was canceled. The cancellation had no effect on world greenhouse gases and only created uncertainty for would-be investors in Canada's economy. The new national regulatory regime, or Bill C-40 or C-69, was enforced into an existing regulatory process, the National Energy Board, that was already a world leader in safety, integrity, and environmental protection. We feel there was no need to amend this process. The new UNDRIP legislation, Bill C-15, will create additional uncertainty and additional legal ambiguity in the economy that is already hindered by major project delays caused by lawsuits that challenge our own constitution. The NCC has already expressed its issues and concerns regarding this legislation and has asked through its partnership and hearings that the federal government consider alternative legislation to fulfill its promise for reconciliation for First Nations in Canada. The NCC believes that increased Indigenous community participation in the natural resource industry through employment, contracting, and ownership will increase Canada's competitiveness. We want the federal government to give First Nations a share of ownership and control of Canada's natural resources in a manner similar to what the U.S. gave 13 tribes in Alaska. Who better to give ownership of natural resource development than First Nations? Our people have lived on this land for thousands of years. We respect and want to protect the land. Many people will come and go, but First Nations people will never leave this land. We have a spiritual tie to the land. We will never sell our lands or resources. Since 1971, the Alaska tribes have had the authority to sell their lands and resources. Not one tribe has ever considered selling their land. We have missed out on 150 years of natural resource development in this country, along with countless billions of dollars worth of projects that would have supported thousands of jobs in Indigenous, rural, and remote communities. It is time for Canada to grant First Nations the right and ownership of their natural resources. Instead of using new legislation like UNDRIP as a form of reconciliation, the NCC requests that the federal government consider an act similar to that of the Alaska tribes that will provide ownership of lands and resources currently owned by the government of Canada. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, a report issued by the Liberal Party under the leadership of John Chrétien, recommended that federal government grant to Aboriginal peoples of Canada 30% of all the lands and resources owned by the federal government as a form of reconciliation. Through this report, the federal government possesses the ability and justification to grant this to all First Nations in Canada. We are hoping that your study will provide our chief with an opportunity to create a reconciliation process that provides real and tangible benefits to First Nation communities and supports Canada's economic growth and competitiveness. Together, we can defeat unreserved poverty. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and further discussion.
Thank you very much. We'll now start our round of questions. Our first 6-minute round, we will start with MP Poliev. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So often, red tape and regulation are portrayed as something that the corporate sector is worried about. But in fact, large corporations actually love heavy red tape because it's a great way to keep out competitors. Makes it advantageous to be large and be able to afford lawyers and consultants and lobbyists and connections to people in power. But as Ms. Jones from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business points out,
Madame la Présidente,
small businesses.
Madam Speaker, could you ask Mr. Poilievre to replace his mic?
Could you put your mic between your upper lip and your nose, please? We're having trouble hearing you. Thank you.
See, there you go. More rules and regulation here. But I was saying that large corporate entities have no problem with red tape because they can hire lawyers, lobbyists, and other powerful insiders to influence government, write the rules that to shut out competition and keep themselves on top to protect the incumbent by keeping down the challengers. And Ms. Jones, you said in your testimony that according to Canadian Federation of Independent Business surveys, the heavy red tape burden falls disproportionately on the smallest firms. Do you have more detail on that finding?
Yes, so the smallest firms pay 5 times the cost per employee if you look at it on a per employee basis, because of course bigger firms have more employees with which to spread the costs over. So it is absolutely a kind of a barrier to entry for those firms, as well as it's kind of a regressive tax if you want to look at it that way. So
right.
For firms with fewer than 5 employees, they pay $7,000 and more, you're looking at about $1,200, just to give you a sense of those costs.
Well, and well-established corporate entities have no problem with regulatory red tape that shuts out their competitors. In fact, it was funny the other day that the Enbridge CEO actually said the current government and the anti-pipeline movement makes his existing pipelines more valuable. In other words, all of the governmental blockades against pipelines are actually enriching those pipeline companies that already have pipe in the ground, because now they face less competition from new pipelines. The same goes for a warehouse. Mr. Dashes, you pointed out that in Toronto, it takes much longer to get a warehouse approved than it would in South Korea, Singapore, or elsewhere. Well, those who already have warehouses then can charge very high leases to their tenants because there's no risk that those tenants could go off and build their own warehouse. So again, this favors the rich and the well-established incumbents. And then we go to housing. Of course, the red tape that prevents housing construction is wonderful news for millionaire mansion owners because it drives up the value of their real estate while making the young, the poor, and the renters much worse off. A huge wealth transfer from the working class to the super wealthy. Mr. Datchus, can you comment on what the $600,000 of extra governmental costs in Vancouver to build a house, or the $250,000 in Toronto to build a house, what that will do to poor and working class people who are trying to aspire to the dream of home ownership?
Let me put those numbers in the context of some of the broader debates that we've seen around the world over the last 60 plus years. I think about wealth inequality. You think of the findings that you've seen around the world of more wealthier people getting richer and richer. If you look at the trend around the world, the increase in housing costs has driven almost all of that. And so this broad societal problem that we think is fundamental to so many things is fundamentally a housing issue. And that's just on the wealth inequality side. Studies in the United States have shown that the increase in housing regulations there have been one of the single most important detractors from U.S. economic growth.
Right. And what you have is what I call a snob mob. These are the very wealthy aristocratic elite who already own houses in these leafy, beautiful neighborhoods and want to keep everyone else out. And so they lobby against construction of new housing to drive up their own home prices and prevent the poor and the working class from ever having a home. And this is happening mostly in uber progressive towns like in the States in San Francisco, but it's happening in Vancouver, downtown Vancouver, the ritziest communities of Toronto. They are blocking and lobbying against the construction of new affordable housing with the effect of keeping their own property values up at the expense of the poorest people around. Don't you think we could solve some of the poverty and inequality problem if we got governments out of the way and allowed people to build houses?
Absolutely. The key is to find the right balance between local input into planning processes, so that people who are residents of an area whose largest investment is their home, they have a stake in their ability to see the future of their community, but at the same time, not so much power that they restrict development. This is where the development permit system in Ontario and other provinces might make the most sense, where it brings the planning process up a level,
and
rather than go ahead.
Right. And just while I know some will say, well, this is all municipal and provincial, remember, the same municipal governments that are driving up housing prices are coming to the federal taxpayer asking for more housing dollars. So they think it's a federal issue, or else they wouldn't be bringing it here. We should protect taxpayers and future home buyers by holding governments accountable for how much they're driving up home prices and other costs of opportunity.
Thank you very much, MP Polyev. That's your time. We'll now go to MP Jasic. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd certainly like to thank all the witnesses today. Competitiveness in Canada is a very broad subject, and you've each brought your own perspective to the issue. I would like to focus in on the Competition Act itself. So, first of all, I'd like to ask Monsieur Vaillancourt about some of his testimony in relation to one section of the Act, the abuse of dominance provision. And just so you know, Monsieur Vaillancourt, we've heard many opinions related to the Competition Act. Another area is the efficiencies defense. Some people feeling that should be very much modified, if not done away with. I guess that I sort of have a fundamental question. Is it time for the federal government to conduct or commission an in-depth review of the Act as a whole?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that's a fair question, and likely it could do with a wholesale revision and reviews. There have been a few times where there have been large amendments, 1986 being one and 2009 being another, although at a smaller scale. So particularly with issues around digital economy, and I think that some of the amendments that were made initially were made, and now that we have the track record to see how it's panned out, particularly this private access to the tribunal, initially a limited right was granted. The reason it wasn't more broad and including abuse of dominance is there was this floodgates concern, which really hasn't borne out at all over the last 20 years or so. So I agree that it would make sense to give a more in-depth review to the Act.
Thank you. And in respect to the number of complaints that are actually investigated, you pointed to the fact that there were just a very small proportion. Would you say that the lack of investigation is because of a lack of resources, or is there something particular within the Competition Bureau's mandate that does not allow them to pursue the complaints? Is it more one than the other, or could you elaborate? Because you did talk about a lack of resources.
Yeah, so I mean, I have the perspective of a private practitioner where we do hear reports from the Bureau on things such as these statistics. Ultimately, we're not in the decision-making room where priorities are set. The Bureau does have enforcement priorities that they publish every year. From my observations, it seems that if you have a matter that falls outside one of those priority areas, it's more difficult to get the interest of the Bureau. I think ultimately it does come down to a question of resources. Certainly of the 467 complaints, I doubt that all of them were worthy of carrying forward to the next level, but surely more than the Bureau was able to take a look at with its limitations in its budget. When it has other parts of its mandate, such as criminal enforcement and the mandatory merger review, where those are more fixed costs. And I think that where there's some squishiness and money has to get cut, my perception is that is more on the this type of stuff, the reviewable matters.
Thank you. In respect to the competition tribunal, we as committee members did receive a brief through the clerk from a former member of the competition tribunal. And he was very much of the opinion that it seems to have become a rubber stamp. And he also felt that the tribunal should be able to hear consent agreement cases. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I think as far as, you know, I think that just as in a criminal matter where a judge in sentencing retains discretion, you know, perhaps some residual discretion to the tribunal may be warranted. But, you know, the settlements that are negotiated tend to be very complex and based on a lot of very complicated factors. And so, you know, I think that there is a risk that that it's sort of like a Jenga tower, of where if the tribunal wants to pull out one piece because they don't like that, then it can have an unintended consequence of blowing the whole thing. So I'm not incredibly passionate about that recommendation.
Thank you. Mr. Datchis, you did have your hand up. I see it's up on and off. Did you want to get in on the conversation on the Competition Act?
Yes, very much so. The reason being is that the CDH Institute has a competition policy council, and this is comprised of top-ranked academics and practitioners active in the field of competition policy. And I wanted to point the committee to that group's work. It hits on a number of these points that you've asked about and that David's raised. Two I'll just mention. One being on private remedies in the Competition Act. The group did endorse that request, and on the need for the Bureau to have more resources. So there's lots that you can use from that group.
Thank you very much. And do I have any more time, Madam Chair?
10 seconds.
Anything, Professor Larkin, that you would like to add on the Competition Act? I saw you nod at one point.
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree with a lot of the things that have been said here. This idea of looking at gaining efficiency on one side, and it's something that needs to be looked more into because it's a vague issue. It's hard to interpret, and it's not clear who those benefits efficiency apply to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Notre prochain tour, c'est député Lemire. Vous avez...
We have Mr. Lemire, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to know if we could ask Mr. Polyev, Member Polyev, I think it would be interesting to question him on this vision that he has. I think that could be very interesting. In any case, I will be talking to Madame Jones of the Business Federation. And I'm wondering if there, in terms of impact on small businesses, my question would be the 2 or 3 best measures to simplify and to lighten the burden so that we could have less administrative burden for businesses.
It's a very good, and it's a question we often get asked. What are the, give me the top 5 things we can do to make life easier for a small business? And it's a difficult question to answer because it isn't any one thing. It's hundreds of things. It's thousands of things that businesses have to comply with, which is why one of the things we're recommending is that there be, in order for businesses to better communicate with government departments, that there be a portal, a kind of a consultation, a wide open, like a suggestion box where businesses can go and say, there's a broken link on this page of difficult to understand, or this regulation is conflicts with this other regulation and I don't know what you want me to do, or I phoned your helpline 10 times and I got different answers and I was waiting for 5 hours to get those answers. These are the kinds of things that I think the deputies across government need to hear so they can focus on not just fixing the big things, but fixing the hundreds of thousands of small things that cumulatively add up to a very big burden, not just for small business owners, but for citizens. You know, we hear these things, whether you're applying for welfare or maternity leave, or, you know, the forms are difficult to understand. And imagine the time savings we would give back to Canadians and improving the relationship between government and the citizens it serves. And I think that that kind of accountability and transparency is very important.
Merci, effectivement, votre...
Thank you. Your idea of a portal is very interesting. I'd like to go a little bit further. What do you think should be done in terms of having better consultation with the different actors between the government and business?
Another very interesting question, and a very good question. I think one of the things that I've heard over and over, both from those inside of government and those outside of government, is COVID-19 has changed the world in terms of the openness with respect to the dialogue between those outside of government and inside of government. And I think we need to build on that foundation. There's a lot more work to be done. So consulting with those outside of government early in the process, not once the regulation is, there's just only some tweaking to do with how the regulation might be implemented, but very early in the process when the policy ideas are being developed, I think is really something that we heard loudly and clearly on the External Advisory Committee from outside, those outside of government. So that would be one important suggestion.
Et conséquemment, comment on arrive?
And how could we consult so that we have some consistent measures? What type of reference point do we need between the government and the business people?
Well, you're asking a question that brings us back to one of the big challenges when it comes to regulation. There are there's very little data available with which to evaluate what is happening. So there are some individual studies, but within government, there's very little. I can't answer, you can't answer the question with government data, how big is the cumulative regulatory burden? You don't have the data to answer that question. You don't have the data to answer the question, are we making progress at reducing that burden? You don't have the data for that. So it brings us back to really a very fundamental problem with this file. And when you contrast that to the data that we have available when it comes to taxes, say incroyable, that we don't have this data. It's just unbelievable to me.
À votre avis, comment jugez-vous les actions?
How do you judge the federal government's action, past and present, with respect to this issue?
Well, this has been a long-standing issue for small business, and I think a growing issue for Canadians, as we heard from on the cost of housing and other frustrations that Canadians have. Big businesses have their own issues for decades and decades, but I think it's becoming less and less affordable for Canadians. So I think the External Advisory Committee that I chaired until it was recently came to an end was a good start, but it's really just the beginning of what we need to do. One good thing I'll say in Canada is that it has been nonpartisan in the sense that all government parties seem to understand that at least the definition of regulatory excellence that I put forward, reducing red tape while maintaining health, safety, protection, and also empowering innovation, the heads seem to be nodding, and we're fortunate here that that's the case.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very
Merci
much.
beaucoup.
Our next round of questions goes to MP Massé. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to start with returning to the Competition Bureau issues that we have to Ms. Larkin and Mr. Valancourt. If the problem that we're faced with right now is there was a review to the Competition Bureau, I was around that it didn't really do a lot. We did some, but Is there anything that you would identify being that like the top three things that we could do right now if there was consensus in Parliament? I think an extensive review is more than outdated, is more than like warranted by all means. But are there some low-hanging fruit items that you would suggest right now that might find all party support? I think this is the biggest problem that we have as a competition and in our country, in a competition bureau that doesn't have the powers that even match, as you've identified, the United States or Europe. And there's several formats. But over to you, Ms. Larkin, to start, and then Mr. Valancourt, seeing if there is some things that we can identify that might find all party support.
Sure, thank you so much. I think the broad framework within which the Competition Bureau operates is correct. You want to evaluate every merger, for example, has its benefits and its costs, to evaluate the net benefits to the consumer, and this is what you go with. What I feel is happening is that sort of the translation of this broad framework into the action that we end up seeing. For example, this idea of evaluating efficiency gains against market power. It seems that in many mergers that clearly seems to increase market power, still the resolution is that to go ahead with the merger because there are some efficiency gains to be achieved. And this may be correct. However, it is difficult for me to evaluate in many instances to what extent efficiency benefits do outweigh the market power. Moreover, with the idea of efficiency gains, I want to mention that it is important to maybe redefine as to who is the focus of these efficiency gains. Because if a company, as a result of the merger, can produce at lower cost, it definitely benefits the company, that is the shareholders of the firm. However, it is not clear as to who else ends up winning from that. If prices go up, consumers are definitely hurt. Moreover, improvement in efficiency often comes on expense of removing duplicate operations, which automatically leads to layoffs. So this is another important aspect that I think is important to keep in mind, and I didn't see fleshed out enough in the decisions of Competition Bureau.
Okay, thank you. With that, Mr. Valancourt.
Thank you. So I think that the main one is the one that I've appeared on today, the private access for abuse of dominance, which not only I think would have broad cross-party support, it's also pretty widely supported within the competition bar itself. And the C.D. Howe Institute, as earlier, put out a paper a couple of years ago on private access to abuse of dominance. And the members of that panel are senior members of big downtown Toronto law firms and senior economists. So, you know, that group, the majority of that group thinks that there should be access granted for abuse of dominance. So, you know, I think that's really a no-brainer. Another one possibly is dealing with the leave test itself. Some of the private action components where you can seek leave require that a company show that they've been directly and substantially affected by conduct in question. And we've got some tribunal jurisprudence where 22% impact on a competitor was found to not be enough of an effect in order to bring a case before the tribunal. And I think that, you know, that really hampers the effectiveness of the private access to the tribunal. That, you know, those are the two main ones that I see off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. I'm going to quickly move over to Ms. Jones. You mentioned, Ms. Jones, the length of time for members to get access to things, and it's interesting because many of the regulations we have in place are because of bad actors. You look at the housing, for example, how many people are doing renovations under the table and without permits, affecting everything from insurance costs, rates, public safety, and so forth. And a lot of people think that it doesn't really matter. I don't have to get that deck permit. I don't have to get this. I don't have to get that. And then you have all the, like I know across in my neighborhood on my street, somebody's had to have, you know, the municipal building inspector out on a regular basis just because they won't follow the rules. And this is a person that actually owns a business and is very much, you know, known in the community not, having to have enforcement. What do we do about those situations? Like, I don't get up any day and come to this job and think about, well, I can't wait to get another regulation in place. That doesn't do any good for my small business people, but like, we have to pour in all kinds of money for the public. Anything we can do to maybe get the bad actors out of the way?
Well, I think that there's a tremendous opportunity with digitalization and the use of AI to really better categorize who your high risk actors are and separate out those low risk people who are, consistently in compliance with the rules. But that does require modernizing the systems, and there's a whole lot to say about that as well. But I think that's an important priority.
Thank you very much. We'll now start our second round of questions. Our first round goes to Député Généreux. Vous avez 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the witnesses. This is very interesting. Madam Jones, I am a business person myself for the last 30 years, and with my associate of 29 years, we were 2, and now we're up to 30 in this business. So I'm a perfect example of a small business, and it has become a medium-sized business. We've created good jobs, and we are the equivalent of what is really the backbone of the Canadian economy, the structure, if you will, all the business people across the country. Now, in the document that you have, there's a statistic which is that 63% of business people wouldn't recommend that their children continue on in business. Whereas we've seen that there were business people that would want their children to continue in business, take over the business. It's not easy, but what is it that since 2017 there's been such a change? And I'm a member of your organization for the last 20 years, but since 2017, well, there's been this huge drop. So what have you observed? What is going on?
I think there's a little bit of a sense of hopelessness around this issue, and a feeling that things continue to get worse, and will this ever be a high enough priority for government to turn the tide? On top of that, and I'm speculating here because we didn't ask why has your view changed, but on top of that, although we explicitly in the study we did asked survey respondents to put aside COVID-related regulatory challenges in order to so that we could have some data with which we could compare. My strong suspicion is that it was very difficult for business owners to do that, particularly when it comes to questions like, would you advise your children to start a business? But the comment I would make is I think that this, whatever caused it, the state we're in with respect to this is quite worrying from 2 perspectives. One, we have a number of boomers retiring from their businesses, and so we have a generational succession, business succession that we want to go well in Canada, I think, independent of COVID-19. But the second overlay, I would say, is with COVID-19, you have a number of businesses, we've all seen it in our communities, a number of small businesses who have closed their doors. And the economy overall is smaller. The small business economy is much smaller than it was going into COVID. And we, I think, as Canadians, want independent businesses to thrive and survive. That's going to require new businesses to start. Mm-hmm. And if they're saying it's not worth it because of the red tape headaches I'm going to have to deal with my government, that's a big problem for all Canadians because they are over half of the private sector employment in this country.
J'ai été élu la première fois en 2009, pardon, ça fait 11 ans déjà, et j'ai été sur le plan de pétition pendant 4 ans, je suis retourné dans mon entreprise, mais j'ai quand même suivi la politique fédérale à ce moment-là. Quand je suis revenu, et encore aujourd'hui, l'augmentation du red tape semble être un phénomène qui est non pas en dégression, mais en progression. On semble rajouter toujours des nouvelles contraintes à l'entrepreneurship. Qu'est-ce que vous conseillez? Parce que vous parlez aussi qu'il n'y a pas le gouvernement ne détient pas de mesures ou en fait de data qui permet d'être capable de comparer véritablement avec les années, plus on avance dans le temps. Moi, je vais vous dire, la création d'emplois, en tant qu'entrepreneur, bien sûr, mais aussi en tant que parlementaire, m'intéresse énormément. Qu'est-ce que vous proposez ou qu'est-ce que vous, selon ce que vos membres vous disent, ou même vous en tant qu'organisation, proposeriez au gouvernement de façon vraiment très, très, très rapide et très instinctive qu'on pourrait faire rapidement pour changer les choses? Parce que moi, si 63% des gens qui disent à leurs enfants de ne pas aller là-dedans, on a un sérieux problème. Là.
So I apologize if I didn't understand the question completely because the translation seems to have gone up. Mais je comprends un peu. And I think you're asking what practically can we do to change the situation. And there are several things. First of all, we have to get serious about measurement. And the federal government has, for a long time studied it, but we need to be serious about measuring it. And I'm going to tell you right now, the measure won't be perfect. And so I think I'm out of time, but I'd love to say more.
Unfortunately, I'm pretty good at measuring the time. So unfortunately, that slot is finished. And we will now move to MP Johari.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. I'm actually going to go back to Madam Jones. Madam Jones, in your opening remarks, you talked about a cultural shift that needs to take place, or it's taking place. Can you expand on that one?
To expand on that. So I don't think that the vaccine is a good example, right? Normally that would have taken the better part of a decade. And there was an understanding that we had an outcome here that we needed to achieve. And that was more important than while we needed to continue to check all of the health and safety boxes, we needed to get rid of anything that was unnecessary in that process. And there was some doing things in parallel, for example, that helped speed that up. That's really a change in thinking. I think at the municipal level, the idea of approving a patio in less than 48 hours, it would have been, just completely inconceivable. At the provincial level, we're allowing doctor's appointments to happen online. And so there's a focus on what needs to happen. There's a focus on yes, making sure that the health and safety and environment is protected. But I think there's been a shift away from worrying about things that aren't aiding those two things. And that
so what you're saying, sorry to interrupt, what you're saying is it's becoming more outcome based. We need to become more outcome based. We need to become more agile. We need to be able to, be strategic. We need to collaborate, and we need to be able to do parallel run, yet meeting all the guidelines and working collaboratively together. Great. So having said that, you identify data availability as one of the challenges. Now, is there other challenges, first of all, aside from data availability? Because you seem to spend a lot of time on data availability. Mm-hmm. Is there other challenges that, aside from data availability, that you like to highlight?
Absolutely, the challenges that you just flagged that have to do with the culture. I would say those are the two big challenges: the culture, and so being very risk averse is another piece of that culture. And trying to, when you try to get risk down to zero, the problem is you introduce other risks, and there's a lot of risk aversion in the system.
Thank you. You talked about data availability or lack of data availability, which you said impacts accountability. Therefore, restrict the number, the amount of reporting and the frequency of reporting that could be put forward. What type of data? And I know this question was asked before, but what type of data would be most prominent to be made available at the early stages as we build, more systems or processes to be able to gather more data?
Well, of course, you're going to want the data that looks at, very specific rules. And we have some of that when you think about cost benefit analysis. There's a lack of sector specific data. But what I would say the biggest thing that's missing is kind of a fairly simple, straightforward aggregate measure of the total burden of regulation. And here we have a tendency to want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. But I would look at both Manitoba and British Columbia as good examples. British Columbia 10 20 years ago, set about to reduce its burden by 1/3 in 3 years, they've actually cut by about 50%. And they have a fairly simple way of measuring it. Is it perfect? No. Has it driven a lot of good changes and has it reduced the regulatory burden for citizens? Yes. They also do an annual report where they look at other things outside of the measure that have improved the lives of citizens. So, for example, simplifying forms for welfare applications.
Okay, so we'll end up back at the measurement, and you once again highlighted BC and Manitoba as the one that they managed to reduce the burden by about 25%. And you didn't get a chance to finish your response to my colleague, Mr. Janru, but can you finish your thoughts on the measurement, because I think that's the one that's really going to tie the challenge and back to the cultural shift.
Okay, so in British Columbia, what they do is they measure every time there's a shall or a must or some kind of prohibition. They count that not just in the regulation, but also in the legislation and the policy, which is important. They call this regulatory requirement, and they had a count of about 380,000 when they started. That's what they set the target to reduce. Manitoba did a more comprehensive measure, and they came out at close to 1 million regulatory requirements. And they also have set a target to reduce those requirements. And what it does is it focuses the mind across all departments that what can we reduce without affecting those health, safety, environment outcomes. And I would say the bureaucracy is very good at that. They're very good at protecting the health and safety outcomes.
Thank you. And my apology, Mr. Darche, I didn't get a chance to allow you to respond.
So perhaps at a subsequent round, he could chime in. Our next round of questions goes to Député Lemire. Vous avez 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to be asking the question of Madame Jones. It's interesting, all of the elements that you've mentioned. You're saying that the costs are inversely in proportion to the size of the business. The smaller the business, the greater the cost. And so this really is not good. What do you think of a principle of 1-to-1 that the government would take away some of the costs?
Sorry, I'm not sure the translation was perfect at the end of your question. So was asking what would I think of the government taking away some of the costs for small business?
En fait, c'est un principe.
Well, it's a principle that if you add one regulation, you take another regulation away, so that you would not be increasing it. So that.
Je comprends. Okay. Yeah, so this is like a one in, one out policy, and we have that in place actually federally in Canada. Thankfully, almost everyone, I think there was only one MP who voted against it at the time, so it was widely supported. The challenge is that it's on a very narrow base, so it only looks at regulation, but a lot of the burden from regulation comes in the form of the policies. Some of it also comes actually in things that are in the legislation, and those are left out. So one simple recommendation would be to include those in your one in, one out policy. But I would suggest that that only maintains where you are, and that federally we have an opportunity to reduce. And so I would suggest a 1 in, 2 out policy for a time period to achieve that 25%. And then you go to the 1 in, 1 out. That's what British Columbia did. And they continued to reduce with that policy. So they hit their 1/3 reduction target. But since then, with 1 in, 1 out, they have gone to almost 50% reduction. And British Columbia maintains high levels of health, safety, environment. So it's an example of what can be done, how much reduction you can have while still protecting the things we all care about.
Merci. Dernière question.
Thank you. So do you think there's enough accountability in the federal government?
Simple answer, no.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Massey. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to return back to the issues related to the Competition Bureau, because I think that they're really important. So back to Mr. Vaillancourt and Ms. Larkin. what is Canada's reputation with regards to our current laws and are out of step with the United States and with Europe? I know that I hear from different congressional and Senate members regularly about the fact that we are a little bit behind and concerns expressed about our trade relations to that. But I'm just wondering whether there's broad range, especially among the academic community and so forth, an appreciation that Canada is out of step with the rest of the world, especially with the digital economy emerging to be quite the discussion point.
So I'll take that first, I suppose. The one area I find a lot when I go to, or when we used to be able to go to conferences, the American Bar Association Antitrust Conference, and speaking to my peers from the United States and Europe, they are all gobsmacked by the lack of the private right of access to the competition tribunal for abuse of dominance matters. It just boggles the mind that it's not an option for Canadian businesses. Given the length of time for this round, I'll cede the rest of the answer time to Ms. Larkin.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. From the research standpoint, there seems to be several big markets examined, the US as opposed to European. And and overall, the conclusion is that US markets are characterized by very lax enforcement, starting from George W. Bush presidency and up until now, essentially. As opposed to that, the European Union stands on the other side of the spectrum. And when you look at the data, there are stylized facts that are sort of consistent with those two ranges. So in US, we see increase in concentration. In European Union, we did not. European Union was the first one to prosecute Google, for example, when it comes to digital economy. So from that standpoint, Canada seems to be much closer to lax enforcement and maybe even to the other side of the spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Cumming. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Dacus, thanks for appearing today. You caught my ear with permitting time, and I toured a facility in Nevada, which was a Tesla facility. And what struck me was how open for business they were. They said, listen, what can we do to make this happen here? And they had a grading permit within 2 weeks, which would be unheard of in Canada. But that's not the only cost, is it, on competitiveness for Canada? You know, when you look at competitiveness, can you comment on it's not just zoning and development changes, but it's all the other costs associated, particularly for medium-sized and small builders, compliance costs, tax compliance costs, CPP going up, EI going up, carbon taxes, like all of that is making us incredibly uncompetitive. And Canada's been on a nosedive on competitiveness. So is it not just a broader issue than just this regulatory framework under development projects?
For sure. And this will actually go back to some of MP Johari's question related to some of the other things that we can think of in the World Bank business measure, which is that let's say I mentioned dealing with construction permits. What about getting electricity hookup? Canadian cities or the city businesses in the city of Toronto are way behind the rest of the world in terms of this metric. So this is again where the World Bank doing business metric can be a very good tool to understand costs of doing business across the country. And so asking the World Bank to do this kind of study will get into things like how hard is it to get electricity set up in, say, Edmonton, or protecting or the court process in Quebec. All these things, so many things that Mr. Cummings, you mentioned in terms of the regulatory burden or other burdens are at the provincial and municipal level. We don't know what a lot of these barriers are, and so we need better data. And the World Bank has a off-the-shelf tool that we just need to ask them to apply to Canada.
And I want to move on to Mr. Swampy, and thank you for being here today. You know, coming out of COVID, and we're going to need enormous economic growth in this country. And we had anemic growth prior to COVID. We were about 1% of GDP, so it was quite slow. you're offering some alternatives, saying that First Nations people want to participate, and we're willing to participate with Northern Gateway. But how frustrating it is for you with added regulatory burdens to try and stop major projects like this. And C-48 would be an example of that, the tanker ban, C-69. I just want to hear more from you about, are you frustrated? Because it sounds like you want to be part of the solution.
Right. I think that our biggest problem was that, first of all, we didn't participate in the 150 years of natural resource development that went on in this country. And I think it was probably partly our fault, partly the government's fault. Our ability to be able to participate in the natural resource industry as employees and contractors needed a little push. And I think Canadians are on the average very polite and progressive individuals. They treat people that come into this country with respect. They help them get a job, get a house, and so forth. We need that kind of consideration for First Nations. The ESG movement that's going on right now has enhanced our ability to be able to participate in the natural resource industry, and it comes at a time when the government has put on so much regulations that we're hindered in our ability to be able to get employees out there. We have, for example, 12,000 self-identified Indigenous and that figure has increased to 14,000, even in consideration of the downturn and so forth. You're seeing more young people wanting to get involved in the natural resource industry because it pays a lot more than any other industry, and it gives you a lot more skills that you can transfer to other industries. And we have to take advantage of that. Last year, we had over $1 billion in contracting opportunities for small businesses. Small business competition on First Nation reserves has increased significantly. You have Port McKay First Nation, who has probably the most contractors per capita on a reserve in the country, with a zero employment rate. It took decades for them to transition from unemployment and despair to the kind of income that they have right now. And we need the government's help to do this. And I think the only way we're going to get away from regulations is to be able to not destroy the regulations, but to get the people that really are concerned about the environment, about the land, about the wildlife, fisheries, the air, is First Nation people. I mean, First Nation people aren't going anywhere, right? So they're the best equipped to handle that.
My apologies, you're out of time, MP Cumming. We'll now move to MP Lambropoulos. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for their particularly interesting testimony today. I have to agree with my colleagues that many different angles have been looked at, and so I really appreciate the information that we've received today. Many of you had made reference to the fact that fewer investors are being attracted to the Canadian economy right now, and that the number of publicly traded companies has significantly decreased since its peak in 2006, that there isn't currently much recourse for companies who are trying to compete against the big players. And so that's where my questions are kind of going to revolve around. So Ms. Larkin, first with you, you mentioned a lot of the stats that you guys found. Did your study find any of the reasons for this decrease? And would you care to comment? I know that you mentioned you may be doing future studies or focusing on this in the future, but what are the main reasons that you found for this?
Sure. Thank you for your question. Overall, the nature of our study is more descriptive. We do find that companies are getting bigger. By the way, I want to make just a minor remark, is that it doesn't necessarily mean that investors shy away from Canadian market, because the overall market cap remains stable. So there is still money going into Canadian economy. However, it is concentrated essentially primarily in large corporations. So this is what we see, the shift in the distribution. So the size remains fairly stable. Let's say growth consistently with the economy. However, it all essentially money goes to large corporation. This is an excellent question as to what are the drivers. Unfortunately, with the level of the data that we have, we are not able to pinpoint the specific mechanism, and therefore more specific data would be important to look at in this case. However, it seems that the findings are overall consistent with the idea that potentially markets could be becoming less competitive. So we see increase in concentration, which by itself does not always point to decline in competition. However, it comes hand in hand with more merger deals, more domestic merger deals, larger deals, horizontal deals. Those large companies are more valued by shareholders, as we see in their market cap. So it seems that all the signs together are consistent with the idea that potentially this could be a sign of decline in competition. Having said that, I still want to caution that this is aggregate data, and more detailed analysis, maybe industry level analysis, specific market level analysis, this is something that would be warranted.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Vaillancourt, you spoke about the ways that that we can change the Competition Act to better deal with the most prevalent issue and complaint that is currently received by the Competition Commissioner, which is abuse of dominance. You gave us certain ways that we can change the act in order to allow people to deal more directly and be able to have to privately litigate and find recourse. However, I was wondering if there were ways that you think we could change the role of the commissioner, or change the fact that why was it that only 11 cases were looked into and not more? What is blocking the commissioner from doing more? And are there ways that we can change the system the way that it currently works in order to make it more efficient?
Well, I think maybe one of the easiest practical, but maybe not easiest political ways would be to significantly increase the budget of the Commissioner of Competition. If the Commissioner of Competition had significantly more resources to deal with these issues, then one assumes that he would. I don't think it's a question of any sort of willful neglect or anything like that. I think that really there are matters that take urgent priority. The criminal enforcement obviously is one of them for price fixing and bid rigging. The mandatory merger review is another, and so it's just a question of, with whatever money's left, that's the money that's left to deal with these abuse of dominance and other civilly reviewable matters. So, I don't think it's a question of structural change as far as what the commissioner's role is. I think that it's a matter of giving significantly more money to the commissioner to fulfill that mandate. And I think that to ease the burden, one way to do that would be to allow private litigants to bear some of that burden themselves.
Okay, well, thank you. I have like 15 seconds left, so that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll now start our third round of questions. The first round goes to MP Dreeshen. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for appearing today. Ensuring that Canada has an appropriate regulatory environment is going to be critical to maintaining our competitiveness and ensuring more jobs and economic growth in the future. And from that point, I'd like to speak to Mr. Swampy. I know that one sector of economy where regulations and regulatory concerns are there is in the energy sector. And I've met numerous people from First Nations, my time in Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. They were amazing individuals that I think many people would be happy to have them as CEOs of their companies, but they're being restricted, and there's a limitation, and we end up with the difference between regulatory burden and political considerations. So there are many ways that we can support this vital sector. You've mentioned the concern about the Northern Gateway decision, which was political. It had nothing to do with the environment. There are so many Aboriginal groups that wanted to be part of this. 39 First Nations that produce oil and gas, over 100 that rely on economic benefit from pipelines passing through their territories. But we can't get that message to the rest of the politicians that make these decisions. I'm just wondering if you can give a bit of an idea how we could change this so that there are no more decisions made in that manner?
Yeah, I think, well, we need more Indigenous participation and dialogue and involvement in natural resource development. As you know, Northern Gateway's project guaranteed $2 billion worth of benefits for the communities, the 31 out of the 40 communities along the corridor. It also included a guarantee that the funding partners, who were 9 producers and Enbridge as an operator, would hire a CEO from one of the First Nations from the communities in BC. Now that was real participation that meant something, right? That meant that the industry itself, the producers themselves, were willing to do what it takes in order to get full participation from First Nations to develop the project. And it's like when we organized the National Coalition of Chiefs, the core members of Chiefs went to the funding partners after the cancellation and said, can we work towards getting the Northern Gateway project back? And the funding partners, who wrote off $630 million in development costs, including regulatory costs, said that Northern Gateway is done. But they would support an Indigenous-led pipeline initiative. And that was important. It got us to a certain extent to a level in which we thought, and a lot of First Nations agree to this day, that they can develop their own projects. So that's what we want to do. And I think that's a way, in order to get the regulatory process in place, is to have full participation from First Nations. So you won't have the consultation problem. You won't have the rights and title issues that go up to the Supreme Court, because you'll have Indigenous people at the table, because they will lead these projects. And that's what we're working towards getting, is not just leading the projects, but owning the natural resource itself.
But there are other projects that have been presented and looked at and it seems as though, because they are energy projects, the regulatory burden that has come from C69 and so on are just putting roadblocks beyond that which you were speaking of. And so I'm questioning, do you think governments would listen to you with regards to how damaging those regulations are? Or are we just going to be spinning our wheels and talking about this forever?
No, I think we are in the impression that there are 2/3 of the chiefs that we canvass every year, we believe, are in support of natural resource development. We are a group that has 81 members right now from across Canada. We believe in the next year or so, we're going to have over 100. And in the next 3 years, we may have as many as 400. We're going to be a national movement. Right now, there's no real Indigenous organizations that's promoting, First Nation defeat of unreserved poverty through, getting involved in the economy. And this is what we have to do. I mean, we let the government worry about the environmental protection when it comes to regulations, because we'll be leading these projects and we'll be doing the environmental protection that we're concerned about most. So we got to keep the drive going. We got to keep getting more members, and I think as we become bigger, we'll be a voice to overturn these really binding legislations, a regulatory legislation that really hurts our ability to be able to sell our biggest asset we have, and probably one of the world's biggest assets, which is our natural resources.
Thank you very much. I will now go to MP Assassi. You have the floor for 5 minutes. MP Assassi, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to everyone who's appeared before our committee today. Now, if I can start with Mr. Vaillancourt, thank you very much for your submissions today. I found them incredibly helpful. My first question is, we've been hearing about the need to change the Competition Act for many years. Abuse of dominance provisions are concerned. You obviously have been following this discussion for many years. In your estimation, how long has it been that these types of recommendations have been made? Because if memory serves, I think we've been hearing about the need to make changes for the past 20 years, but I defer to you.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate estimation. When the initial changes came in 2002, which permitted some private rights of access, there was a discussion at that time about including abuse of dominance, and I think since that time the sort of groundswell of support or the proportionate support for it has increased, in part because there wasn't this stampede to the tribunal of everybody trying to bring a private action for everything under the sun. You know, it definitely has. I've noticed just personally from attending conferences and events and whatnot, there's a lot more panels about should this be, you know, should there be private access, and that's kind of happened in a more concentrated way, I'd say, over the last maybe 5 years or so. But certainly it's been something out there in the environment for at least 20 years.
And as you know, over the past 5 years, there have been no abuse of dominance cases. So I was wondering whether you've had the opportunity to look at other jurisdictions, other peer countries, and whether you have a sense as to how many cases that they go through on an annual basis insofar as abuse of dominance is concerned.
So just a small correction. There actually have been two abuse of dominance cases over the last 5 years. The Toronto Real Estate Board.
Sure.
There was also one with the Vancouver Airport Commission, VAC.
Sure.
I do not have any sort of empirical sense of how much enforcement is taking place elsewhere. But you know, in the United States, I did read an article that it's at a 10-to-1 rate that it's being enforced by private entities versus a public enforcer. So, you know, if you could extrapolate based on that of how much you would expect to see in Canada, you know, and again, I don't know the budgetary constraints in the United States, for example. I don't know if they're quite as severe as they are in Canada. So even the publicly brought abuse of dominance proceedings, I would guess, are higher on a per capita basis in the United States.
Ms. Larkin, do you have a sense of the numbers in other peer jurisdictions?
Well, when it comes to the US, I just have the numbers from the Sherman Act that the Department of Justice uses, and this has been also quite low in the US. In fact, there have been years in which they had zero of those cases. So it's been quite low in the US.
Okay. Now, again, if I could return to Mr. Vaillancourt, your suggestion that there be a private right of action. Have you had an opportunity to look at the legislative framework in other peer jurisdictions? And if you have, if you had to select one of them, which one would you consider to be the most appropriate for the purposes of guiding the members of this committee?
So the American model is based, the statute in the United States is incredibly broadly worded. I think that would probably be more of a model than the European model. I haven't gone in depth with the legislative scheme in Europe. But you know, I think that the framework that already exists in the Competition Act, the Section 103.1, which already provides for private access to the tribunal for some of these other reviewable matters, I think it could just be plugged into that, subject to the qualification earlier about dropping the need for proving that someone's been substantially affected in order to bring a proceeding, just based on how that term has been interpreted by the tribunal.
Thank you. Ms. Larkin, do you have any further comments on that one?
My apologies, Mr. Sassy, you're out of time. We'll now go to Député Lemire. Vous avez 2 minutes et demie.
You have 2.5 minutes, Member Lemire. Thank you, Madam Chair. So my question, it will be to Madam Jones. The weight of administrative charges is heavy for small and medium businesses. What do you think of having an increase that would be for over $30,000 and to lessen the administrative burden for small and medium-sized businesses?
I think if I understand understand the idea correctly, it would be a less charges for smaller businesses, less burden for smaller business, divide. Okay, I think that certainly we should do everything we can to keep the regulatory burden reasonable for all businesses. And there are certain areas where, as you grow, there may be a need for more regulations, and some of those regulations and the burden associated with them could be limited to bigger businesses. And you see some of that in the system, but there's probably opportunity to leverage that more than we do currently.
Merci.
Thank you. One of the issues also when we talk about small businesses, family businesses, you took a position for C2 08. You were saying that to encourage passing on to a family member, this is something that is going to be coming up in the House. So why is it important that this bill be adopted?
It's, I think we need to do everything we can to make it simple to pass on businesses to family members, and certainly to make it fair that it's not more expensive to do that to sell to outside your family than to a member of your family, and to make those successions go well, particularly given where we're at demographically in Canada, where there are a large number of these successions that are going forward. So that's why I think it's just common sense.
One last question for the software used by companies so that they can do their tax returns. What's the problem? The government doesn't have the same type of software? Does everything need to be reconverted? What's going on there?
I think this is one of the recommendations we're making that's very simple, which is that if you're using existing software, just allow that to work with the back end of the government software instead of taking what you've got in the software and then having to re-input it into the government software. Again, another common sense. I think we should just be doing it. What's the problem?
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Round of questions goes to MP Massey. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to let Ms. Jones I asked her a question with regards to the bad actors and how to deal with that. And she didn't really get a lot of time. She did talk a little bit of some of the innovation necessary for that. And wanted to have her maybe conclude her remarks there if you do have some additional comments about that, Ms. Jones.
I would love to see us get away from having the lowest common denominator dictate the regulatory burden for all businesses. I think that that's very destructive, not just directly for the businesses, but for all Canadians, because it undermines our economic growth and our productivity, our prosperity, and these are things that are always important. But I think coming out of COVID-19, there's an extra importance on making sure we're doing everything we can to get back to a prosperous economy. And so what does that take? Well, I think that, again, I said technology can help with this. There are things where we can look at how big is where we can use AI to determine the risk. I think we could do a much better job of giving businesses and individual citizens with good track records with government compliance, a lighter touch when it comes to things like auditing. And we can, they can earn that and then have that good grade. And then there are ways that we can be looking at what are the highest risks for Canadians and who are the higher risk actors that we need to pay attention to, maybe auditing a little bit more and paying attention to. And when we do that, health and safety outcomes will be improved across the board.
Madam Chair, do I have any more time?
45 seconds.
I'll cede that. That's thank you. Witnesses.
Thank you so much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Baldinelli. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. So thank you to all. I'd like to quickly go to Ms. Jones first, and I was actually looking at the Canada's red tape report. The cost of regulations to small businesses, as we've reviewed and you've indicated about the $38 billion is spent, on regulatory burdens. 28% of that is in red tape alone. I noticed in the report it talked about you're actually seeing time spent on regulations by owners going down since 2017, but in fact that could be because of cost. That small and medium-sized enterprises are actually putting that burden on through consultants and hiring other companies to do this for them. So, I mean, I was wondering if you could follow up and just indicate in terms of costs, would you have associated information with that?
So you're absolutely right that the burden in some areas we're seeing a slight decrease, but our measures are fairly broad and aggregate. So I would say that at best we're kind of holding ground. But what we do know is sometimes these things shift around. So, for example, as things get more complicated, you might have chosen to do some of your accounting yourself, and now you're going to have that go to an accountant, or your legal fees will go up because you need legal opinions. Again, these are the ways in which the burden falls more heavily on smaller businesses because they don't have entire departments associated with that. It is the business owner, him or herself, who is doing a lot of the compliance. We know that from our other studies. We also know that they tell us that if they were spending less time on this, they would be doing a better job serving their customers. They would be investing more time in training staff. They would have more money to increase wages. So these are the kinds of things that they would do if they were not spending more time. And many of them also say they would take the opportunity to get home a little earlier and spend a little more time with their own families.
Thank you. And just following up on that point, further in the report, you talk on the notion and the survey with regards to productivity and reinvestment back into businesses. And I was just wondering if you could highlight some of those, not only federally, but as well as provincially. And it's huge. I mean, in terms of reducing those burdens, to have those small and medium-sized businesses quickly inject more strength into the economy by investing in their businesses, by being more productive.
It's the number one answer to the question: what would you do if there were savings there? Is invest in your business, and you have over half of businesses saying they would have more to invest, which directly affects productivity for the sector. And again, if we even come up a level from there and say, well, why is that important? Let's remember that Canada's small and mid-sized businesses provide over half of the private sector jobs in our economy, and they've been absolutely hammered by COVID-19. Again, important at the best of times, but we are not in the best of times for these business owners. And when we ask them what they need for recovery, the tax burden is number one by far and away. Keep taxes, do no harm on the tax side, but very close, or a little bit behind that, actually not as close as it sometimes is, but a little bit behind that. And the number two spot is reducing the burden of red tape. So I think we can't underestimate how important this is for our country going forward.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Madam Chair, how much time would I have left?
1 minute, 20 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I go to Mr. Vaillancourt and talk about changes to the Competition Act. And as you've indicated in the discussions, the notion of budgetary constraints. I believe even the commissioner himself has said resources have plagued the tribunal and the bureau. And so in terms of that, I mean, when an ultimate review, and I think there could be a consensus of opinion that it's time to look at the Competition Act. Now, in terms of that, are there any thoughts with regards to my one colleague mentioned it earlier, I believe, about the Section 96, as well as possibly an update to 103.1. Are there any other changes that you think that could be required?
None that are sort of top of mind at the moment. I think I've covered the main ones that I think are due for a change.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair, I think that would probably take my time.
Yeah, you only have about 7 seconds.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks so much. And our next round will go to MP Erskine Smith. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. And I want to pick up on where my Conservative colleague just left off, Mr. Vaillancourt. So you have principally focused on extending the purview of 103.1 beyond sections 75, 76, and 77 to 79 and the abuse of dominance. What about section 81 and delivered pricing?
So as I understand it, delivered pricing has never been, there's never been a proceeding under delivered pricing. To be perfectly honest, my familiarity with the section because of that is kind of limited. It just
Understood.
doesn't come up.
So the focus on abuse of dominance is because it has been the most heavily requested, but there has been great inactivity. When it comes to early July of last year, we had the national grocers in, and they inexplicably talked about communicating with one another about reducing wages in the pandemic. I know Sobeys, though, to their credit, has reinstated pandemic pay. Would you support updating our wage fixing laws? I know it would be a per se criminal offense in the United States, from my understanding from guidance there, but would you support that measure here?
I mean, when I read that in the news, that consultation had happened, that was surprising to me, particularly given the issues in that industry with the bread price fixing problems that they've got right now. So it was a little bit of a surprise to hear that revelation.
So maybe it may be something we want to consider then. And we heard from a witness last week, I think it was, in relation to the efficiencies defense needing to be updated. Do you have any comment as it relates to the efficiencies defense?
I have no comment on that section.
That's okay. And with respect to mergers and acquisitions, my understanding is, from speaking to some counsel, M&A transactions in Canada, Competition Commissioner confirmed this for us at his last attendance, that there's a statutory bar after 1 year. I understand that the FTC is looking at reviewing M&A transactions going back 6 and 8 years. Do you think that that kind of misalignment is a problem and we should maybe look to update that?
I think that business certainty, there's a point at which, if there's problems on a go forward basis, I would think you could capture that with abuse of dominance, because it's the issue of substantially lessening and preventing competition is in both the merger section and in the abuse of dominance section. So I think if there's problems like 5 years down the road, that the abuse section might be the better way to deal with it than to try and unscramble a transaction from years ago.
Though my understanding would be that the abuse of dominance provision relates to specific activities delineated in Section 78, anti-competitive activities, whereas the idea as it relates to M&A would be we're concerned about, in some cases, the Shaw-Rogers deal potentially, with hyper concentration in a particular sector. And so it may not be that they engage in anti-competitive activities, so it wouldn't engage abuse of dominance, but it may well be that it's substantially less in competition all the same. But I take your point, business certainty. 1 year seems strict though, so it used to be 3 years, is my understanding. When it comes to penalties, do you see the penalties as particularly stringent enough in the Act to date? So we have, in some ways, I've heard some say it's the cost of doing business, and that we should be looking at disgorgement as a key consideration, that AMPs should be equating effectively the penalty with the benefit improperly extracted. What do you think about disgorgement as a focus as opposed to quite modest administrative monetary penalties?
Well, I think that with a private right of action and an ability to claim damages, that would achieve some of that effect. I mean, the AMPs are, I think, it's like $10 and $15 million, so that's not insignificant. Although I suppose with the size of the business, that might be insignificant. Disgorgement. I think the better way to deal with that is through a private right of action.
Understood. So as far as disgorgement is concerned, private right of action, though, is it fair to say we might want to consider updating the penalty amounts?
I mean, I suppose that everything is subject to ongoing review.
Sure. And one other, it's a smaller issue in some ways, but my understanding, we've heard from the commissioner, of course, it's the chair of the tribunal that wields significant power and happens to be a judge. Do you think the tribunal should be term limited as it is in other countries?
No.
All right. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that is the end of the third round. And seeing as there is not enough time to allow for all members to get another round in, what we'll do is we will end here today. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here and for your excellent testimony. I'd also like to, a gentle reminder to our members, if you have not sent your witnesses to the clerk for this study, to please do so immediately so that we can reach out to folks and schedule them with enough time for them to obtain the headset that is required. And also, if you have not provided the clerk with your witnesses for the next study, which is green recovery, which will be beginning in 2 weeks, please make sure to get those names in as soon as possible so that we can start contacting the witnesses. With that, I'd like to thank everyone again for being here today. Merci beaucoup au service d'interprète.
Thank you very much to the interpreters once again, of course, for their hard work, and also thank you very much to the work.
For their time today. And with that, I will call the meeting adjourned.
Merci, bonjour à tous.